This is behind the scenes reading from chapter 5 of Sacred Chaos, Reflections on God's Shadow and the Dark Self by Francoise O'Kane. And today I'm only going to read a portion of this chapter. It's quite long and it has several sections. So I'm going to begin with a section that deals with the Grail and the hero. And so we're talking about the Holy Grail that was famous in Arthurian legend. And hi, Brandy, welcome, and hello, Ron Fan. Okay, Ron Fan, okay. Okay, so chapter 5 is called, let me just start that again. So I'm reading from chapter 5 of Sacred Chaos, Reflections on God's Shadow and the Dark Self by Francoise O'Kane. And this is, chapter 5 is entitled Archetypal Schemas. There's a little introductory section before the actual part about the Grail, which I will read. According to Jung, the confrontation with the self in its light and dark aspects follows a more or less constant archetypal schema, which he defines as individuation. Throughout different epochs and different cultures, humanity has attempted to express this schema in the symbolism of myth and ritual. Many of these delineate implicitly or explicitly a passage through the sequence of death, transformation, rebirth. But the course of this process may vary, and myths or rituals can either focus on specific aspects or illustrate a more global evolution. I can also express a chain of transformations, which Jung specifically means by the individuation process. The motif that Jung calls the night sea journey occurs frequently. An obvious example is the biblical story of Jonah in the whale. As shown there, the individual must go through a regression into the mother's womb in order to return from the journey with a greater degree of consciousness and a more mature attitude toward chaos of the self. In other words, a maturation process away from symbiosis with the original self and the mother must take place. Implicit in many myths of this type is the idea of a heroic journey. The hero symbolizes the ego voluntarily confronting the darkness, the depths of the unconscious. Of course, the hero meets with threatening, dangerous events. The search seldom follows a linear course, and he makes mistakes, becomes dispirited, and comes close to giving up. But the hero is frequently guided by positive figures who provide the strength to carry on. The quest is eventually successful, and the hero is transformed. Or rather, the situation that precipitated the journey is transformed. It is usually quite adequate to interpret these myths this way. In certain cases, this interpretation is the only possible one. But as far as our theme is concerned, the image of the triumphant hero is not the only useful one. In other words, this image is incomplete, for it does not always suffice when confronting the unfathomable or sinister aspects of the self. To be sure, the hero needs to be strong and brave enough to overcome obstacles. One chooses to understand. One chooses to undertake a journey, perhaps moved by an impulse that is not fully conscious, but actively participating in the search. Psychologically speaking, this presupposes an ego stable enough to focus on a given aim and grounded enough not to be destroyed at the first difficulty. Not everyone has such an ego. Besides, a less heroic, less active attitude might prove just as useful. Then the aim would not be to triumph over obstacles in order to reach a fundamentally new, transformed situation, but rather to best use the limited energy at the ego's disposal to find a new kind of grounding. This would allow for renewal from within, with strength and hope coming from an intrapsychic flow of energy. In that sense, the propitious attitude needs not always to be heroic, and it is not always ego consciousness that must be broadened. With respect to the individuation process, a new form of awareness may be more important for the analysand than reaching a specific aim, or even than a logos-type understanding of the way the psyche functions. In order to show what I mean, I shall examine a myth that illustrates a heroic quest, but I shall view it from a different angle. The Grail and the Hero. The basic Western motif of the search for the Grail, that is, for a mysterious treasure, is found in folk tales of the type exemplified by Grimm's The Devil with the Three Golden Hairs. Here is a summary. Quote, a youth who has been born under a lucky star must go to hell to bring 3 hairs from the devil's beard. On his way, he is asked various questions to which he must find the answers. For instance, why a tree does not flourish, when a ferryman will be freed of his duties, how the sick prince or princess can be cured, why a spring has gone dry. He gets help from the devil's mother or grandmother and receives the 3 hairs. He also learns from them the answers to the questions. On the homeward journey, he answers the questions and receives a large reward. The king attempts to imitate his exploits and dies. The hero marries the princess. And the footnote is the complete Grimm's Fairy Tales, number 29, pages 151 and following. In the Grail legend proper, a Christian legend that rests at least partially on historical facts, and of which there exist many different versions, these motifs are organized in the following way. Quote, a mysterious, life-preserving, and substance-dispensing vessel, the Grail, is guarded by a king who does not want to die, in a castle that is difficult to find. The king is either lame or sick, and the surrounding country is devastated. The king can only be restored to health if a knight of conspicuous excellence finds the castle and at the first sight of what he sees there, asks a certain question. Whom does the Grail serve? Should he neglect to put this question, then everything will remain as before. The castle will vanish, and the knight, should he neglect to put this question, then everything will remain as before. The castle will vanish, and the knight will have to set out once more upon the search. Should he finally succeed after much wandering and many adventures in finding the Grail castle again, and should he then ask the question, the king will be restored to health, the land will begin to grow green, and the hero will become the guardian of the Grail from that time on, unquote. And that quote is summarized from The Grail Legend, which is this book by Emma Jung and Marie-Louise von France, called The Grail Legend. Reading on. The best known among many versions are those of Chrétien de Troyes and Wolfram von Eschenbach. De Troyes' Percival belongs to the Breton cycle and was completed after his death by various authors. Von Eschenbach's Parsifal remains close to de Troyes, but supplements it with an ethical and religious perspective on chivalry. It has a more serious, less imaginative tone and asks the questions of the nature of good and evil and of the responsibility of man toward God. In this version, the Grail is not only a mysterious, fascinating object, it becomes a symbol of inner life and of ascetic discipline. Parsifal seeks extreme spiritual purity, and his Grail is not a vessel but a stone. This version may thus be interpreted in its relation to alchemy as a compensating movement to the Christianity of that time. Jung has shown that alchemy had attempted to fill the gaps left open by the tension characteristic of the 12th and 13th centuries. But let us go back to our basic version. Here, the Grail is a relatively well-defined symbol. It is said to be the cup from which Christ ate and drank and instituted the Eucharist on the day of the Last Supper. In another version, it is the cup in which Joseph of Arimathea received the blood of Christ at the descent from the cross. Joseph founded a community whose members met every day around a table in honor of the Grail. They kept a chair free for its future defender. Jung interprets the vessel as a feminine symbol and comments on the need for medieval Christendom to renew itself through the inclusion of feminine and irrational aspects. At another level, the Grail vessel with its bivalent contents, the Eucharist and the crucifixion, may symbolize the self, including its nourishing and death-bringing aspects, that is, life and renewal versus pain and despair. It also symbolizes that part of the self we may never grasp, God's immanence as manifested through symbols. In the Christian legend, and in von Eschenbach's version in particular, and in von Eschenbach's version in particular, the quest becomes an allegory for the continuing search for God, for the God image. Within this context, the Grail vessel may be connected to the sacred vase, or even to the magical cauldron of Celtic mythology, the provider of ever-renewed nourishment. It is also akin to the alchemical cauldron. As a mythological vessel, it dispenses life and healing, strength and wisdom. It may contribute to a transformation similar to that taking place during the communion mystery of the Mass. As a hidden treasure, it may be found where the grass is greenest, where the meteorite has fallen, or at the end of a rainbow, which connects it with a cosmic dimension. More generally, the Grail may be seen as the provider and container of soul substance. It may image the transcendent function, and may contain the capability for psychic synthesis between conscious and unconscious. Its discovery allows one to live in harmony with oneself and to be nourished by the self, precisely the qualities the ailing king is lacking. I'll stop there for a moment and look at your comments. Ranfan asks, the process journey described here is often misdiagnosed as depression by modern psychiatrists because all of modern society seems to suggest that the purpose of life is to continuously function on the surface level of the mind, whereas the actual purpose of life is to descend into the unconscious and purify it. So those going through this latter, deeper journey are often labeled as being merely dysfunctional from the perspective of the unenlightened reductionist materialist paradigm of the present day. Thank you, Ranfan. That's a useful comment. And the reductionist materialist paradigm would refer to Freudian psychology. Brandy says, life and renewal, pain and despair are a measurement of the same thing, correct? Yes. Andrew Hoff says, Ron Fine, you just accurately described the past 2 years of my life experience. He's described the life experience of a lot of folks. That's why there are so many versions of the Grail legend out there. Andrew says, I discovered Jung about a year into that experience. Prior to beginning my reading Jung, I had come to describe precisely what you said, just without the proper words. It was very difficult. Yes. And Brandy says, that is exactly how I perceive the Grail. Okay, good. All right, so reading on. In many versions of the legend, there are two kings, whom the Celtic tale calls the Fisher King and the Old King. It is obvious that the two royal figures represent different aspects of the same psyche, but the distinction between the Fisher King and the Old King allows for a more precise interpretation. For those who knows, I'm using my chaotic dragon mug. For my own purposes, and in order to simplify, I shall follow only the hero's path and try to understand what Percival of the future Grail King represents, without taking account of the different figures he meets on his way, not even that of Gawain, with whom he makes up a classical pair of twins, or light and dark brothers, such as are found, for instance, in the Gilgamesh-Enkidu pair. I do not look into his origins either. In one French version, the hero is Galahad, son of the knight Lancelot. For Chrétien de Troyes, who remains closer to the popular version of the legend, he is simply a young man who has lost his father and has been brought up by his mother. He discovers that he is interested in chivalry and goes to King Arthur's court. That would be comparable to a young man who has the warrior archetype constellated and joins the Marines. Anyway, reading on. The original situation corresponds to that of an individual who is wounded, has lost any sense of meaning, and who does not feel alive any longer, the barren country or wasteland. The Fisher King, the ego, the dominant attitude of consciousness, is not capable of healing himself. Libido is blocked. The Old King, the Grail's keeper, is sick too, unable to die. He cannot affect the passage to the next stage of life. The problem then is twofold. The Grail cannot feed either the Fisher King or the Old King. Both life and death are blocked. Neither passage can be traveled. The problem results from there being too great a distance or a lack of communication between the opposites, between conscious and unconscious. The hero's task, at least initially, will be to reestablish the flow of communication and libido. But in terms of the self, the Fisher King is near the life pole, but he cannot be fed by this life. The Old King is close to the dark pole, the unconscious, and death, but he cannot confront them, and the vessel he guards is of no help. Neither king can help the other. Also, in his role as the keeper of the treasure, the Old King plays the same role as the devil in the Grimm tale. In terms of individual psychology, this type of situation results from a one-sided consciousness, whatever that may be. The ego may take too rational a position and and repress the irrational, or it may focus on the material aspects of life and neglect the spiritual, or it may have chosen good to the exclusion of evil, etc. There is a lack of wholeness. Inherent aspects have been excluded from the totality of the self. In this polarization, the Fisher King and the Old King cannot contact each other. At the time when the Grail legend was written, the beginning of the 13th century, the suppressed elements may have been connected mainly to the feminine, chthonic dimensions of life, but the Christian and chivalrous ideals stress But the Christian and chivalrous ideals stress other values: courage, purity, the light aspects of the eros. The tale of the devil with the three golden hairs is probably produced by a similar collective situation, since it is the devil's mother or grandmother who, symbolizing natural wisdom, helps the hero find the answers to the riddles. In both cases, there is a split between the opposites, and the Grail vessel may symbolize the alchemical cauldron in which these opposites can undergo a chemical reaction and mutually transform. As we have seen, initially the Fisher King cannot truly live, and the Old King is unable to die. Both consciousness and the unconscious need renewal. Their sterile relation needs to be modified, and the individual's attitude toward them must be transformed. In Jung's terms, the transcendent function must be constellated in order to reconnect the ego with both the positive and negative poles of the self. It is this healing task that the Fisher King delegates to Percival. Who then is Percival? How does he relate to the transcendent function? How will he be able, by embracing both poles, to reconnect them and to free the libido that was blocked? It is said that he is a knight, but a number of versions also call him a fool, not a madman, but a youth who is a bit childish and innocent. One could, of course, blame him for lacking the maturity he may need to be the true hero, who has to grow away from the unconscious and from the mother toward a broader consciousness. But I also see Percival as the fool in a more positive sense. He is the one who does not follow a straight path, who surrenders the security of a rational, one-sided attitude. He is close both to an active instinct and to sublimation, but also to blind impulses and to the unconscious. In some versions, these two aspects are in fact attributed to two figures, Percival and Gawain, who represent two poles of the same archetype. Furthermore, the fool touches both on the divine and on the animal nature of man, and so can reach beyond that paradox. His spontaneity is not destroyed by the tension between opposites, and so he can follow every path without being determined by reason and collective norms. This is precisely what enables him to overcome the split, that is, to heal it. The fool belongs to the realm of eros in both its dark and light aspects. He obeys feeling and the irrational. Obviously, before he can leave on his quest, Percival must be conscious enough to accept the challenge and determined enough to set out for his goal. He cannot be an unconscious fool, but fool he must be, needing sufficient innocence, the child's innocence in a positive sense, to remain in contact with the worlds of the spirit and of the instincts, with both the active ego and blind impulses from the unconscious. From the beginning of the quest, the presence of Percival, the fool, justifies the hope that the initial situation may be transformed, that a vital element will unblock the flow of libido. Leaving aside the various stages of the quest, I stress only those aspects important for my purpose. Percival, like the heroes of so many tales, makes mistakes, often does not know where the path is taking him, sometimes has to retrace his steps, and at times gives up. But as a fool, he instinctively knows that the shortest way is not always the best, and that quite often a circumambulatio will bring him closer to the unseen aim than a head-on approach. This aspect, too, is connected with the instinctive wisdom of Eros as opposed to the purposefulness of Logos. The path with heart is not a linear as logic. The path with heart is not as linear as logic and reason. It includes shadows and apparent failures. To follow it requires patience and the surrender of absolutes. However, and this is very important, Eros is neither sterile nor aimless. It involves an investment of vital energy, real work. I am reminded here of the ritual work discussed in Chapter 3, where the participants actively allow the sacred chaos to erupt into the linearity of profane time. Whenever the hero or the initiate is foolish enough to submit to these energies, a renewal can take place. Obviously, passive submission does not suffice to effect change. Work is required, together with an openness that allows the participants to be touched by an emotional level. Work is required together with an openness that allows the participants to be touched at an emotional level. Percival accomplishes this ritual work by persevering on his path and not being discouraged by his mistakes or dispirited by obstacles. Because he manages to stand the chaos and even to be inspired by it, his unflinching exertion takes him further. Because Percival shows heart, that is courage, and the ability to forego measuring himself against a model, he finally succeeds and finds the Grail castle. At a more schematic level, we could formulate the steps of this quest as A, separation from the old wounded attitude. B, letting go of the guidance of the fool. B, letting go under the guidance of the fool. C, being able to assimilate the new elements, each of these steps involving an investment of energy. This schema requires neither linearity nor a need for all the steps to be successful. In fact, for a psyche that finds itself in the initial situation described above, it does not matter much whether the quest actually succeeds. That is, whether the Grail is found or the question answered. This is shown by the fact that as soon as our hero asks the right question, and before he actually gets an answer, the country is regenerated and both kings are healed. Thus, I see the quest itself as being far more important than its request. Thus, I see the quest itself as being far more important than its results or its aim. The psyche in which the fool is present through Eros and the unflinching will be underway, inevitably The psyche in which the fool is present through Eros and the unflinching will to be underway inevitably generates the vitality missing when both kings were sick and the poles of the self were split. To my mind, in the case of Percival, but also of numerous other heroes, any interpretation that insists on linear steps and the definition of precise aims denies the quest its truly healing dimension. Psychologically speaking, even when apparently nothing is being achieved, energies are flowing and affecting a transformation. I would just say as an aside here that I often talk about the necessity of the Job archetype, which is contest, defeat, lamentation, and rebirth. And that's basically the same process that we're talking here. And, you know, a lot of people, including John Vervaeke, Jordan Peterson, and Paul Vanderklay, are talking about the so-called meaning crisis. And the answer to the meaning crisis is, in your life, is to get one. Okay, in other words, get started. Don't worry about the fact that you might make some mistakes. You will, but press on, and eventually you will reach your goal. And that's the way to live a authentic life. And you can find a video by me on this channel about living an authentic life. How to live an authentic life, I think, is the name of it. Okay, reading on. In the Grail legend, Percival finds the old king's castle and asks the crucial question. He then succeeds both kings, which means transformation takes place at both conscious and unconscious levels. In other words, the hero finds his place in both worlds, sacred and profane. But the question he asks, as well as the answer he is given, are not the clear ones demanded by interpretations of the hero that stress logos and the search for absolute truth. He asks, whom does the Grail serve? The answer is the king. The question, first, is somewhat paradoxical. Percival was sent on his quest specifically to find a cure for the disease suffered by the Fisher King and his kingdom. The answer thus seems redundant and becomes less mysterious only if we remember that the old king, despite being the keeper of the Grail, cannot be nourished by it, being blocked in a hopeless situation. The king to whom the Grail may belong, then is likely to be a new king, symbolizing an attitude in which polarity is transcended, a king who can relate to both of its poles, something like what we need in the United States right now. Okay. I have a note in the side of this page here. Let's see if I can show it to you. Okay. And my note says too much meaning. And so this is the paragraph that is next. Do not insist on this formulation, I do not insist on this formulation, although some versions of the legend and an interpretation according to which it reflects problems in medieval Christendom suggest specific answers. But it seems to me that if the quest is taken as a search for a mystical center, for a God who would correspond to the true nature of the self, it is quite natural that the legend's question and answer could only be formulated through a paradox. In this, they put it in a way that is adequate to the true nature of the self. If too much stress is put on meaning, the problem of the dark side of God is not solved. In the legend, it is neither spiritual nourishment nor sublimation that makes it possible to reconnect light and darkness and to heal the king's wound. It is an innocent question asked by a fool carried by Eros that brings new life. Further, it is not, at least in certain versions, a pure, fearless knight endowed with a high degree of spiritual perfection who finds the Grail. It is a human. It is a human in his fool aspect who, by accepting the chthonic and the irrational, and by learning to use a new form of thinking, an alchemical turn of mind, asks the question that will eventually transform the situation. Of the analyses presented in the previous chapter, it is, of course, Miguel whose quest eventually most closely resembled Percival's. I mentioned that at the beginning he was highly motivated and sincerely sought healing, but he was trapped in his ideals and tended to move it too rational, too heroic a level. Sorry, I'll read that sentence again. But he was trapped in his ideals and tended to move at too rational, too heroic a level. Okay, I just mentioned that I have not read, nor do I intend to read, chapter 4, which is about Dr. O'Kane's patience and practice. And so that's what she's referring to here in Miguel. For instance, after he started sliding into the abyss of isolation and loss of reality, all the attempts I made at depotentiating the situation that I considered dangerous brought no result. Miguel objected that he would get nowhere unless he was totally involved. Not that he wanted to remain on the edge of psychosis, but he took no account of my warnings, motivated as I now see by my own fear that this stage would come to a bad end. In this sense, Miguel showed heart, but he remained too long the fearless knight, and in insisting on marching on no matter what was happening, he did take a risk. Also, it was only after he progressively allowed himself to be guided by a more foolish type of hero that he found renewed vitality. The traits that I have emphasized here are found in numerous other myths and folktales. For instance, there are tales in which a naive or even dumb hero commits one mistake after the other, where animals, the instinctive dimension of the fool, know the way and help the quest to progress, or whether the development of eros through a confrontation with both the other sex and with the anima fulfills this function. But I would emphasize one thing above all. When interpreting myths related to individuation, that is to be the relation with the self, one should take full account of the manner in which a patient one should take full account of the manner in which a patient acceptance of sinister aspects brings the hero further. Analyses in the traditional heroic mold are prejudiced toward light and a positive attitude. In a way, they proceed in too rational a manner, and they may forget to ask the right question, that is, to integrate an acausal dimension that is inherent in the nature of the soul. In looking for A, we may find B, and this B is precisely what the psyche may need. In the tale recounted at the beginning of this chapter, the devil himself is present and guards the treasure. Only because that hero succeeds in relating to the grandmother, a witch who eventually assumes a positive role, does he find the answers. The adequate attitude there, the hero's way of confronting the dragon, does not involve cutting off its head. Okay. All right, so that's the Grail legend. I've been reading from chapter 5 of Sacred Chaos, Reflections on God's Shadow and the Dark Self by Françoise O'Kane. And I'll just look at your comments here. Let's see, where am I? Eric says, a lot of connections to Joseph Campbell's theories, yes. Ron Fun, Freud did offer many unprecedented insights. I don't think it can be appropriate to dismiss his work as a whole, though evidently it did in many respects carry with it extreme limitations. Yeah, I agree with that. I probably am too dismissive of Freud, mainly because I focus all my work on Dr. Jung. And, you know, Dr. Jung did say that he would be with Freud to the end of his life, but for the fact that he was stuck on materialism and the rational approach. And Ranfine goes on, what's needed is the ability to read his work with a careful eye, distinguishing his genius in certain areas from his ineptitude in others. And for one who can do so, he's an equally exceptional to Jung. Certainly his book on dreams is very useful, and I'm sure many others. I'm not a mental health professional, and I haven't focused on all these debates on philosophers going all the way back. I just don't care about those things. Those are all sterile debates as far as I'm concerned. And what I'm particularly interested these days is in the religious aspect of Dr. Jung's work, which has been hidden both by Jungian analysts and everyone else. And so I'm trying to bring that forward so that people can be aware of that, because as I often say, Nietzsche found that God was dead, which is true based on the way Christianity had been taught, based on a rational approach over centuries. And what Dr. Jung did was come along in the next generation. He found the living God, where he lives, and how he goes about doing the work of the Godhead. And that is a fundamental thing that's missing. It's a fundamental idea that's missing in our discussions these days, and we need to recover it if Christianity itself is going to be resolved, but also all other religions. And Randy says, amazing, my most inner thoughts. Grace, hi, Skip, Grace. The higher one's consciousness, the crazier they appear to those operating in lower levels of consciousness. Yes, I'm sure that's true. Randy, even a master fails many times before he is complete. And I would add to that no master is ever complete. And Grace says, yes, Brandy, many layers. And Brandy then goes on, let's see. Absolutely, Grace. Whole balanced vibrations and all, Shabbat Shalom. Interesting. What I would add with Shabbat Shalom is that for millennia, all of our religions have been at odds with one another and pulling against one another. And it's time for all religions to turn back toward one another and find those things which are useful in the perspectives and rituals of the others. One of those is Shabbat from the Jewish tradition, which is the Sabbath. And Lawrence Yaffe, who was the son of one of Dr. Jung's closest confidants, Agnella Yaffe, who was Jewish, called it God's only daughter. And the other is in Islam, the tradition in Islam, the tradition of praying 5 times a day, which is certainly useful and couldn't hurt anyone. Might help, you never know. Brandy. Grace, I was thinking the other day about great masters and geniuses from long ago and how they were considered crazy in their time. It's so amazing how I can be myself here. Grenade, the idea of a one world religion scares me. Well, you won't have to worry about it, Grenade, because it's not going to evolve very quickly. And Dr. Jung's estimate was that it would evolve over 600 years. And John Vervaeke, in one of his videos, has this idea of creating a Wikipedia page of some sort, and we're going to put all the good ideas in the various religions and then try to mix them together and make something good. And I promise you that that will be a mishmash and not something good as he proposes. I have a funny photo of that if I can find it quickly. Let's see how good Skip is at finding a funny picture here. Let's see. Question is, where is it? Where is it? It's not that. Just a minute. I think here it is. Yes. Hooray. I will share this with you. So if you follow John Vervaeke's approach, this is what you get. And this is figures 16.3 and 16.4. One is the third picture of John, and the 16.4 is the second picture of Luke. And these are from the Hexaherasticon of Sebastian Brandt, which he wrote at about the beginning of the 16th century. And that just gives you a sense of just how weird things can get. If you select 1 from column A and 2 from column B and 3 from column C, you're going to get a religion that looks like that. Okay, so therefore, the religion has to evolve. And if it evolves the way John Vervaeke wants it to evolve, Grenade, you're quite right that it is scary as hell. Anyway, okay. So I have done the reading of the Grail and the Hero. Tomorrow I'm going to read Initiatic Surrender. And what that refers to is the need for initiation in society. And I'll come back to you on that tomorrow sometime. And Brandy's comments, yes, because I feel that no war in anger was ever won. Quite so. No war was ever won. We're still certainly still fighting the Civil War in the United States, and it was known at the time of the Founding Fathers and well before that slavery had to be resolved. And the Founding Fathers, and I'm talking about Washington, Jefferson, and Madison, Hamilton, those people called the problem of slavery in the South the wolf. And we're still suffering from that wolf 400 years after it began. And we have to learn how to integrate it and live with our fellow Americans, regardless of race, color, creed, or national origin, or language they speak. That's clear. However, we do have some regressive elements in our society who don't want to do that. Or we have acquisitive elements in our society that want to keep that debate going as a way of maintaining their control or their power. And yes, Grenade, you're quite right. It's more complicated than slavery. And so the human condition is certainly way more complicated than any one issue that we face in the world. And we're all part of an alchemical experiment by our creator to see whether we can survive or whether we will make ourselves extinct. And we're, as Dr. Jung observed in 1956, the world hangs by a thin thread, and that is the psyche of man. And it's still true today. Sean says, political science is a business, so is religion. Oh my God. We have to distinguish between what's the business and what's the actual truth behind the business and that sort of thing. But that's what we each have to determine for ourselves. It seems I've created quite a bit of controversy on Paul Vanderklay's channel. His and my interview on his site has been viewed 2,700 times the last time I looked, and nearly 800 times on this site. So it appears we're going to have an ongoing conversation on some of these topics. So I'll see you tomorrow. Peace.